let's talk about how to find your ideal price range so you don't overspend. Most people, when they're trying to get a home, I've come across persons who said that they want a pool in their backyard and they only have about $200,000 that they could afford to spend. So you have to be realistic and understand where you are. The good part about renting to own is that you can pay down your balance low enough to the point where you can qualify. So even if you can only qualify for 180,000, you can still find something for maybe 210, 220, 230 and set up a contract where you can pay that balance down over a period of time, right? So we'll be talking about getting pre-qualified, the cost of purchasing a home, the cost of maintenance as a homeowner, and also lastly, determining your price range based off of all of these factors, right? Now, if you've never been in contact with a bank, before you decide on the areas that you want to look for, the type of place that you want to look for, you need to be sure of what you can qualify for. It doesn't make any sense you waste your time meeting with sellers, you know, finding out that they want to sell their home for 325,000. You actually like the place, but when you contact the bank, you can't even get the mortgage for it. So you don't want to waste time going to view properties first. What you want to do is you need to figure out what your finances is. Get pre-qualified with the bank. Now, it doesn't mean that you'll be approved. You have some people who go through that pre-qualification process. The bank tells them that, hey, you qualify for $200,000 as a mortgage. And 3 months into the process, they find that they actually can't even get the mortgage, right? So being pre-qualified does not mean that
Frozen.
you're actually going to get the mortgage, okay? So make sure that you contact any bank. You have RBC, First Caribbean, Bank of the Bahamas, Scotia, your Mortgage Corp, and then I think you also have some private firms that does mortgages. But it'll be good that you speak to all 5 of these institutions or all of these institutions to get an idea of what you can qualify for, because one institution might qualify you for 190. This other one may qualify you for 200,000. This other one may qualify you for 170. So based off of the lowest number, you want to use that as your base. All right. What I essentially would do is I would take a calculation from all 5 of those institutions. So let's just say Bank of the Bahamas says they're going to give me 190,000 for a mortgage. Scotia says they're going to give me 170. First Caribbean says they're going to give me 200, so on and so forth, right? What I would do is I would try to get the average number based off of all of those qualifications that I received. So to get the average number, what you need to do is calculate all of the offers that you receive. So let's just say if you got 4 pre-qualification amounts from the banks, right? You're going to calculate all 4 of them. Once you get the total figure for all 4 of them, so let's just say each of those places say that they're going to qualify you for $100,000 each. What you would do, 100,000 plus 100,000 plus 100,000 plus 100,000, right? Obviously, this is a very simple way to look at it, but let's just say 100,000, 110, 120, 130. Once you add up those figures, then you divide it by 4 because you got pre-qualified by 4 different places. And then you would find the average pre-qualification number. If that's too complicated for you, just go based off of the lowest number. So if the lowest number that they said that they'll qualify you for is 100,000, you know the most at the end of your contract that your balance needs to be is 100,000 in order to pay off this place. Okay? So keep that in mind. Find your price range first. And that's where you get it through the pre-qualification. You have a base range that you start off with, right? Then now let's talk about the cost of purchasing a home. When you initially go for a mortgage, you have to pay a deposit and then you have to pay closing costs, right? Nowadays, some banks are asking up to 20% as a deposit. So if you have a home that you're interested in and they're charging, or the seller wants to sell it for $100,000, that means you got to come up with about $20,000 initially if you're going to get the mortgage, right? And that's only for the deposit. Then you have on the back end the closing costs. Sometimes you're allowed where you can get homeowners exemption or first-time homeowners exemption, where you don't have to pay as much in closing costs. But even in that case, the bank still wants to see that you're even liquid enough that even if you are going to get that exemption through the government's tax benefit or exemption, they still want to make sure that you have these funds on hand, right? So in order to purchase a home, you need a deposit. Then you need the closing costs. Closing costs is VAT and stamp tax. That's usually about 10%, and that's usually split between the buyer and the seller. Sometimes in these rent-own contracts, because they're giving you installment payments, some sellers would say, hey, I would do the rent-own contract with you, but you're going to be responsible for all of the closing costs on the back end. So you have to consider that full 10%. Then you have mortgage commitment fees, which is about 1%. Then you have lawyer fees, which can range between 1 to 2%, right? Then you have to pay for appraisals on the home. Then you have to pay sometimes for life insurance if you don't have life insurance. Then you have to pay for homeowners insurance. And then there's some other miscellaneous fees that you pay on the back end in order to successfully close off a contract or close off a home or buy a home successfully, right? So when you think of it, even if that initial stamp tax and VAT is split 50-50 with the buyer and seller, your 5% as a base that you automatically have to pay for closing costs. Then for mortgage commitment fees, you have another 1%. So that's 6% in total so far. Then your lawyer might charge you up to 2% for closing costs. I mean, for them to do their work, which is another 2% on top of that 6%, which means that it's about 8% already. So when you think of a 20% deposit or even a 10% deposit, plus another 8% deposit on the back, payment on the back end, if you're buying a place for $100,000, that you need about $18,000 liquid in order to be entertained by the bank. If you're buying a place for $200,000, that's about $36,000. So you understand how expensive just purchasing a home can be even before you even move in. So what I like about the rent-own contracts is that because you would initially submit a deposit and the rent credit that you have that is reducing the balance over a period of time, all of that in most cases would be seen as you already submitting a deposit. So the time of your contract, you're saving towards your closing costs because you can't avoid closing costs over here. Unfortunately, I think in our jurisdiction, it's very expensive for closing costs. Sometimes in the States, I've heard of people only paying about $1,000 or $2,000 on the back end for their closing costs, compared to us, where we got to pay $10,000, $20,000 on the back end. And in most cases, most of us aren't walking around with 40 grand just sitting on an account waiting to be used on the home. And in fact, if you spent the last 5 to 10 years, saving up money, ain't no way in hell you're trying to give all of this money up front to the bank, especially if it took you so long to, acquire this capital, right? So consider the closing costs on the back end when you're negotiating your prices. Now, the challenge, once again, with closing costs is that even if you get a seller to sell you their property for a low price, when it's time for you to pay closing costs, you're paying the closing costs on the appraisal value and not what you actually buy the place for. So in numbers terms, if a place is worth $150,000 and the seller agreed to sell it to you for $100,000, you're going to be charged 10% or those closing costs on 150 and not what you negotiated. I know it's so unfair, right? Now let's talk about the cost of maintenance as a homeowner. Most of you, if you currently rent right now, you're only really used to paying your utility bills, and that's just the light, right? As a homeowner, you're responsible for everything. And if you've ever had to maintain a home, it could get costly. Sometimes you might have the wiring go bad in the home. You have to fix that, right? Sometimes the air conditioning units in the home could go bad, especially if it's like let's just say, central air units. You have to repair that. Let's just say you end up with water pipe leaks. You got to get something happening in the bathroom where the toilet bowl is leaking. You got to fix that. If you have where there was damage to a window, you have to fix that. Let's just say after a hurricane has happened and you have a bunch of debris in the yard, you're responsible for making sure that all of that is cleaned up. So most of us are, if you're coming from a landlord-tenant relationship, you're used to that landlord being responsible for everything related to making sure that everything is maintained. But when you're transitioning over into a real estate owner or homeowner, there is more responsibility. So your responsibility is not just your monthly payments. So when you're negotiating with sellers, you have to consider, what would it cost me on a monthly basis to maintain the home? How much would it cost me to cut the yard? Sometimes you're spending about $100 to $200 a month if you're not cutting the grass itself, depending on the size of the property. That's more expense for you, right? So think about all of these different things that goes into becoming a homeowner. And this would help you to stay within a certain range, because obviously if you get something with a big yard, then you know that your lawn maintenance bill is going to be expensive, especially if you inherit or if you take over a property where that person had a love for flowers and there's a lot of upkeep with maintaining those flowers, right? Or there's a lot of, let's just say, fruit trees in the yard, and they're always dropping stuff in the yard. So consider these things before you go and make offers on homes. Now, based off of all of those factors, you want to now determine what your price range would be, right? You know what your monthly expenses are in terms of, well, not your monthly expenses. You want to make sure that you have a consistent income coming in. I would not tell anybody to take over a rent-own contract if they aren't making any income on a regular basis. Okay, you still want to hold out for that because in most cases you have to come up with a deposit, right? And you don't want to lose your deposit because you couldn't afford to maintain your monthly payments. So consider the fact that one, how much can you afford to pay as a deposit? You want to write that down. Your price range. What is the least that you want to pay, and what is the maximum that you would like to pay? Sometimes you might find a seller that may accept your offer for the lowest deposit ever. Remember that home that I spoke about in Yamakura? That if you really considered how much I paid up or how much I told them that they would receive up front, that was about $3,500. Now their home, in most cases, someone would pay about at least about 10,000, 15,000 for a place like that. But you get what you negotiate for based off of how you negotiate, right? So you want to first write down what is the least that I want to pay for a deposit, and what is the most that I'm willing to pay for a deposit. Write that down. Then you want to consider what is the most that you can afford in monthly upkeep and maintenance on a home. What is the most that you're willing to pay extra in terms of utilities, in terms of your maintenance on the yard, in terms of the general maintenance of the home, in terms of water bill, light bill, internet bill. What is the most that you can afford to pay on utilities? Once you figure that out, then you would know what you have left over to pay as a monthly payment in a rent-own contract. So this helps you to identify which areas that you should be looking for. Because let's just say at the end of it, you calculated that, hey, the most I can afford to pay right now is $700 a month in rent. When I consider that maybe I'll be spending about $300, $400 in regular monthly maintenance on the home, then you know that there's only certain areas that you can get a $700 monthly payment in. So you don't want to be looking in Treasure Cove and you can only afford $700. You don't want to be looking in places like Serenity and you can only afford $700. You have to be realistic based off of where your finances are. I come across a lot of people sometimes who want my assistance with getting a home, and they would say, hey, Mr. Monk, I can only afford, or I'm looking for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, and I want to pay $800. Then I ask them, what areas are they interested in, right? And sometimes the areas that they tell me, in my head, I'm thinking that obviously you've never done your research. You don't even know what the going rate is in the market. Because one way that you could determine what you should offer as a monthly payment, you want to look for the equivalent of what places rent for in that area. So if on average, let's just say in Cable Beach, you have 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartments renting for $1,400 a month, there's no way a seller is going to accept your offer for $800 or $1,000 a month for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in Cable Beach, unless they're very, very desperate. I'm not saying that you can't find those types of opportunities, but they're few and far in between. And to not get discouraged throughout this process, you want to stay within areas that you know your budget could afford. It may not sometimes be areas that would be, I guess, the first place that you go for, because everybody has an idea of what they want their dream home to be or their dream investment to be. But honestly, stay within your price range and then work to improve your financial status later on. You creep before you walk and you walk before you run, okay? So after you figured out all of these things, you would know exactly what price range you should stay within, what's the most that you could afford to pay, so you know if you're wasting time with a certain seller or not before you even present an offer. And in some cases, you probably not even present the offer after you've heard what they want from you, okay? So let's recap. We talked about getting pre-qualified. Speak to as many banks as possible to see where your overall purchase price range falls in. Once you know what you can qualify for, you know what is the maximum amount that you can offer as a purchase price, all right? Or you know what the maximum your balance should be at the end of your rent-own contract by the time is you're going to pay off the balance. Then you know the cost of purchasing a home, the closing costs, the VAT, stamp tax, lawyer fees, mortgage commitment fees, life insurance, homeowners insurance, the initial deposit, appraisals, all of these extra costs, right? And then you have the cost of maintenance when you become a homeowner. Maintaining the yard, maintaining air conditioning units if there are any in the home, maintaining any piping inside the house, maintaining if any wiring goes wrong in the house, you got to fix it. Making sure that the yard is cut. All of these things are now transitioning from a tenant to now a homeowner. Okay, so your responsibility is a whole lot greater, especially if you've negotiated in your contract that you'd be responsible for these things, okay? And then once you've identified, what you can qualify for, what's the most that you can afford to pay for monthly maintenance of a home, to determine how big of a home that you should be looking for, or how small of a home that you should be looking for, whether it should be a home, whether it should be a townhome, a condo, vacant property, you'd know where your sweet spot is, okay? Now, obviously, you're not gonna have the perfect numbers, but it's always better for you if you can be a little bit more educated with your approach, because you don't wanna be wasting time.